All right. So we're on number 6, I think, under the section of necessary practices for attaining spiritual life. And the first one was just living in the presence of God constantly, being aware of your own awareness, being aware of the I am, that image of the beloved that is you. And we should try unceasingly to allow each one of our actions to become a moment of communion with God, a moment of offering that, just like in karma yoga, everything that we do is done for the sake of the divine. Whatever we give, even simple things like eating. I bring this one up often because it's a wonderful practice that I find. I don't know how would I say it. Whenever I remember it and do it while I'm eating, it's such an interesting experience that when you put some food in your mouth, don't focus on the taste. Immediately see it as a third party, as if you're the shrine and you're offering food to the Lord. And don't, as you notice the flavor, don't analyze it in your own mind. Pass it up. Just pass the flavor directly to the Divine Mother or to God or to the presence, and just as if you are not the one tasting it and eating it, but as if you're offering it on the tongue of your own shrine for the divine. It's a wonderfully intimate way of thinking and an intimate connection for a moment, to offer like that, and it deepens that understanding that that's the reality, that God is experiencing herself through you, through your body. And that the problem with our delusion or our ignorance is that we're kind of like a little puppy thief, jumping up and grabbing the experience and calling it ours, rather than allowing it to be experienced through us and calling it divine. So he says we should try unceasingly to do this in everything that you do. See it as the divine. So when you're turning in your homework, you're offering it to God as it's done. And when you do your homework, you're doing the best job that you can, your work, whatever it is during the day. I was actually trying to do that today as I was sanding off the stuff from our new shipment of steel for the sculptures. I had earplugs on, I had goggles on, and a hat on, I had gloves on, I had an apron on. So I was very insulated, and it was kind of quiet in my own little world there. And so I started to try and consciously, buffer that steel as an offering, and that also changed very much the nature of the work, and the communion of that experience. So his number 2 is to try and do that as much as you can in the presence of God. And then the third one is that we must work quietly, calmly, and lovingly before God, beseeching him to accept our labors. So always consciously observing our state of mind, observing our state of being, to make sure that the right spirit is there, that love is coming through as purely as possible, and that nothing's getting in the way. And then his fourth one that we spent quite a bit of time on talking last week was this: as many times as possible during the day or even during your practice, is to stop and center. Stop, recollect yourself into yourself, follow your breath for a moment, and make yourself consciously aware of the divine all around. Remind yourself of all the little truths that aren't readily apparent in our day-to-day, that we are in the presence of the divine, that we are not the doer, that we are the witness, and that witness is ever pure and ever free and ever beloved. To stop the story of ego for a moment, stop the explanation of the moment, stop putting yourself in the context of past, present, and future, and put yourself only in the present, with no interpreting going on, just experiencing the I am, the awareness of awareness, the presence of God, all of which are synonyms. And to constantly, as many times as you can think of it during the day, no limit to it, just as often as you can do that, Bring yourself home. Bring yourself back to the shrine of the heart for a moment. And then the fifth one is that everything is done out of faith, which means everything done. How to talk faith is a tricky one, because we've kind of ruined it. We've made it sound like it's something that the naive adult child does when he can't explain something. Oh, that's a matter of faith. I don't have any other explanation, so it's a matter of faith. It's a way of getting us to take our medicine without asking questions. And that is just the wrong idea of faith. Faith is to understand a truth and to not allow yourself to experience it differently. You know, it's if you know that love is the only motivating force in the universe, then faith is what changes your behavior to see that, to recognize that. If the scriptures tell you that you are divine, that you are a child of the mother, that you're ever free, ever pure, ever blissful, faith is taking that to heart to produce the motive for experimenting, for testing, for trying. You know, you go to, like I think we talked about, you go to a calculus class. The faith that takes you to a calculus class is the faith that you're going to learn calculus. It's what makes the class worthwhile. And so in this spiritual practice of ours, it's the faith that what these sages have experienced is ours to experience. That what these sages, great sages of all traditions, have found in their experiments, this unity with an infinite one without a second. It's the faith that makes our practice worthwhile, because we believe that what they have said is true, and there's thousands of them that have said it and experienced it. And as you study their paths, you find their paths are very clear and very similar, and that the thing that they overcame in each of them was very similar. So we have a faith that drives us forward. And then number 6 is the one we didn't get to last week, so we'll read this one together. He says, we must diligently examine our consciences to find out what virtues we are most in need, and which are the most difficult for us to acquire, and to learn our habitual sins and the occasions upon which we generally fall into them. What he's doing here is he's making a very Christian description of the practice of discernment, discrimination. What he's saying here is keep your eye on the ego, you know, and find out where is it making your expression of love particular, or where is it metering your expression of love, or determining who gets it and who doesn't, or how much is given or how much is held back, excuse me. And to just look at the way that, and in comparison to what we know to be the truth, to observe the condition of our mind. The most important part is what he says here, to learn our habitual sin, our habitual ignorance, our habitual thought patterns that tie us up in knots, that have convinced us of wrong thinking. Become aware of them. Observe the mind and become aware that it's a machine. Become aware that the mind is not sentient. That when you're arguing with yourself, that you're literally arguing with yourself. There is no mind to argue with. The mind is not aware of its own thinking. It's just an organ of thought that produces thinking, just like sweat glands produce sweat. And every thought in the mind, if you watch closely, you come to understand that every thought is born directly of the previous thought. It's impossible to have an original thought that is not part of this line of samskara, this line of thinking that goes through the mind. And once you begin understanding that, and you begin to see repeating patterns of behavior that are born of mind, you begin to see how you get into those states of thinking, how you get into states of seeking out your vice because of habitual thinking about it. You say no to that piece of cake, and yet that piece of cake just keeps arising in the mind over and over and over again. And it convinces you that you want that piece of cake, when in fact you're trying not to have that cake because you've got diabetes, or you're overweight, or you've already had 4 of them, whatever the thing is. Become aware of your own mind. In the Christian scriptures, they've sorted out ego and weakness and assigned it to an entity, to a Satan, who's always trying to tempt you and always trying to bring you down. In Vedanta, we didn't personalize that. We just called it ignorance, and we called it ego. And so in Vedanta, we do the same practice, though. We become aware of how the mind trips us up. We become aware of our little pet ignorances that we enjoy, that we don't want to let go of. One of a very fruitful meditation that we've mentioned before also is this idea that at this moment, you could realize God if it was the one thing that you wanted more than anything else. And so the fact that we sit here still in ignorance, not realizing God, not seeing God or the divine, is not because it's being withheld from us. It's because we are withholding it from ourselves, because we are choosing something else first. And so this kind of discernment is to accept that fact, take responsibility for that fact, and go rummaging. Go rummaging through your psyche. Find out, what is it that I enjoy about my ignorance that is preventing me from letting go, that is preventing me from renouncing and being free. And so to go in, take responsibility for it, rummage through the mind, and see if you can find where you are tripping yourself up and why. And then the discernment process takes a little bit of a change. Once you find that desire, or find that thing that you like, that you're holding on to, ask yourself, what exactly is it that you're hoping to gain from that? And when you worked it out, you'll realize that it's a name of God. That you were looking for security, or you were looking for unity, or you were looking for power, or you were looking for comfort or pleasure, bliss. All of these things. The one source of all of that is the divine. But we've confused those divine qualities with objects, right? With discrete objects that our mind has created out of the unity that it's actually experiencing. And so to go in and discern these things, to learn our habitual sins and the occasions upon which we generally fall into them. What is the road that always gets you where you don't want to go? What is it that makes you do what you do not want to do? It's a very interesting practice to watch your prayers. You say, "Oh Lord, please don't let me fall into this again. Please don't let me fall into this again." And the next thing you know, you're right in the middle of it. How did you get there? Check and find, because it's interesting. In one sense, we pray to God, and God is real, and God is hearing the prayers. But the final realization that we'll have is that there was no I that was praying. We were actually talking to ourselves, to the divine. And the interesting thing about that is that in one sense, you're asking God for all of this power and for all of this ability to not fall into your vices. And then you are contradicting your own prayer. That's important to recognize. It's important to see that you're praying out of one side of your mouth and undermining yourself from the other side. That is the sickness of ignorance. And that is the thing that cripples us. When we divide our nature into two, we become dual. That's why this world appears in duality to us, because we actually become two people. We become this higher bird, which has this ideal. We know ideal love, we know ideal freedom, we know immortality, we know infinity. And yet we've got this other bird down here that's more interested in pleasure and things that are a quick satisfaction. And so until we realize that there are not two things going on inside, that there's one, that's the beginning of the healing process. And so that's what we want to do. We want to become aware of this internal world. We want to watch where the bifurcation is happening, where our sincerity is breaking down, where our earnestness is not quite so earnest. So this is what he's saying. And we should go in times of temptation, in times when we're really struggling. What do? We should go straight to God with complete trust, remain recollected in his presence, humbly worshiping the divine majesty, right? Bring God directly into your faults. Bring the awareness of God right there, right into the, where we learn that from Sri Ramakrishna is the way that he treated Girish Ghosh, who was an alcoholic, right? Ramakrishna never told Girish Ghosh to stop drinking. Never told him to stop drinking. Why? Because every alcoholic knows he needs to stop drinking, right? That's not what he needs. He needs something else. So what did Ramakrishna tell him? Ramakrishna says, every time you take a drink, Girish, before you take that first sip, I want you to hold that glass of wine up to the Divine Mother. And I want you to thank her for the bliss that you think you are imbibing from that glass of wine. And then take that glass of wine and drink it in the presence of the Divine Mother, in your heart, and share the experience with her. And he knew that's all you needed. When you bring that awareness, or that idea of God, which is the same, when you bring that awareness into the situation, ignorance disappears. That awareness is all that is necessary for you to get out of your vices, right? It just takes repeated effort to become aware, to be aware, to be aware. Because ignorance, what is it? I like to mispronounce it, ignorance. That means you're ignoring your own protestations, your own not wanting this. You're pushing and repressing that side of you down. You're pushing God out of the room so that you can, in your peace, enjoy your vices. And so the healing for that is to bring your awareness into the presence of God in a purposeful kind of way. When you're struggling, don't picture God elsewhere. Become intensely aware of God's presence here and all that that means. Bring in that unconditioned love, that unconditioned support, hope, belief, and trust in you. Not your hope, belief, and trust in God, that's there also, but bring into it God's hope, belief, and trust in you. That's one of the beautiful things about unconditioned love, is that even though you may have fallen into the same vice so many times that you feel like an idiot for trying again, it's up to you to have faith and understanding of the nature of divine love, is that God has never stopped believing you when you said you were sorry, even if it was the 10 millionth time that you said you were sorry. God believes the sorrow, God believes your success, and God sees you as you look on the day of your realization. When he looks at you, and this is the wonder of a holy person, because they can look at you the same way. They look at you and recognize your highest ideal within you. And that's the beauty of holy company. You're inspired, you're called higher, because they're looking past all of the things that you hold on to that break down your idea of strength, break down your idea of resilience, break down your idea of being able to realize God. And it renews afresh that notion that you can realize God this moment. There is nothing barring you. You do not have to beg for this, because you are an heir to this. It is yours to be had. So this is what he's saying. In times of temptation, go straight to God, complete with trust, remain recollected in his presence, humbly worshiping the divine majesty. Tell him your woes and weakness, lovingly beg for the aid of his grace, and we shall find in him the strength that we ourselves lack. Right? So that's talking about it again in that dualistic way, that God gives those things to you. In actuality, the divine is the very source of yourself, and that strength is yours. You have to take it. It's the resolution that is weak, not the strength. You have all that you need to do what needs to be done. That is given to you by your divine nature, which is another way to say from God. All right. Now, there are 3 more points that he's going to bring up here. There are 3 points to be answered in this question. 1, to worship God in spirit and in truth means to render to him that worship which is his due. God is a spirit. Therefore, he must be worshipped in spirit and in truth, by a lowly and genuine worship in the depth of our soul, which God alone can see. It is possible to give him this worship so often that it becomes almost natural, as though God were one with our soul, and our soul one with God. Practice only will explain this. All right, this is that's a beautiful sentence right there, actually. Practice only will allow you to see this. You see, that's the difference between somebody who studies religion academically and somebody who's a practitioner of religion. Someone who takes an academic approach to religion will never see the depth of it, will never understand the deepest implications of it, which don't fall into philosophy, but fall into isness, fall into what is in the moment. And so he's saying that we worship God. Worship is what happens when you're in the presence of divine love. When you're in the presence of of divine love, which has no condition, there arises in the heart a sense of deep gratitude, a deep confidence. That gratitude and that confidence is worship. Worship is not something that you do. Worship is something that happens when you're consciously in the presence of the divine. So worship is a natural response, and it happens deep within, because that worship, that is the beginning of that unity. It's that inspiration to oneness that happens, and it happens very, very deep in the heart, in the depth of our own soul, which God alone can see, that silent place where it's not being observed by mind. It's not being thought about. It's the spontaneous presence, the spontaneous response to the presence. That isn't a calculated response. It isn't a cognizant, an analyzed response, calculated response. It's absolutely spontaneous, due to the awareness of the presence of the beloved deep within you. It is possible to give him this worship so often that it becomes almost natural. It's the way that we should live. A realized soul lives spontaneously. He doesn't calculate out and plan out his actions, because he realizes he's not the doer, that he's a conduit, that God is the doer. He's only the witness to this amazing story of the divine, which is the story of love that you live. Your life is one story among billions that describes God, right? Because everything that you do is motivated by love. Even your vices, they're motivated by looking for a quality of God in objects. That's what your vice is, looking for a quality of God in the material world. Can't be had, which is why we're taught not to do it. Not because it's inherently bad, but because it's inherently useless. You can't get God through the material world. God is before the material world, before mind, before personality, before ego. To worship God, number 2, to worship God in truth is to acknowledge him to be what he is, and ourselves to be what we are. To worship God in truth is to recognize clearly, certainly, and with all of our faculties, that God is that which he is, infinitely perfect, immeasurably removed from evil, and therefore full of all divine attributes. Is not the man unreasonable who does not use all his powers in reverence for and worship of this mighty God. So it's just sitting there in the presence of your highest ideal, a perfected love, a love with no motive, you know, a manifestation of perfect beauty at all times. No need, the need does not drive the perceived movement of God. You know, God is everywhere present, always perfect. So he's not trying to accomplish anything. God is his own perfection, her own perfection. And we are the manifestors into this material world of that perfection. You know, we're motivated and moved in response to that. And if we do that consciously with awareness, that's a Jesus or a Buddha or a Rama. If we don't do it, then we're just normal folk, deluded. Our love is scattered. Our minds are unfocused. And our prayers are diluted also, right? God answers every prayer with a yes. He gives you everything you ask for, but he gives it in ratio. He averages all of your prayers together and gives you the result. So if you pray to become a famous actor, but then you sleep through your audition time, he's going to give you the sum total of your prayer, the prayer for wealth and fame, and the prayer for sleep that kept you sleeping through your audition. So you get the sum of those, and the sum of those isn't what you prayed for, because you didn't take into account the whole prayer that you pray. And so part of this becoming aware is to become aware of everything that you're praying for. Every action of your body is a prayer. Every thought arising in your mind is a prayer. And God always gives you the sum total of your desires, always gives you the sum total of your actions. And for most of us, that's scattered and without focus. And so we have somewhat mediocre lives with somewhat mediocre accomplishments. And we wonder, why didn't I become great? Why haven't I done more with my life? Which is a useless way of thinking to begin with. But the answer to it is that you're not living an aware and conscious life, that you're ignoring a lot of the things that you do and a lot of the things that you think. And you're getting the sum total of those things mixed in with your conscious prayers and your conscious desires. So this is what he's saying here. To worship God in this truth, to recognize, to place ourselves in that presence, and to become aware. Let our presence, let our isness, our reality, become a response to this enormous presence of this amazing ideal, the divine, dwelling within. You know, for the sages, if you read through Ramakrishna's life and Vivekananda's life, you begin to understand that their internal world, the world where God resides within in that inner shrine, for them, that is more vivid, bigger, and recognized first, even more so than the world of the senses. For us, the senses are everything. You know, we can hardly find our way into the stillness of that inner shrine. But for a sage, that's the reality. That in there is bigger than this out here. And the story that really taught that to me is that one where that untouchable came to visit Sri Ramakrishna. And so this untouchable walked into Ramakrishna's room, and Ramakrishna stands up, salutes him, falls flat on the ground, and does a full-on Ashtanga pranam to this beggar, to this untouchable. And the untouchable's horrified, because for him to be given such honor from a holy man puts an incredible debt of grace on him. So he's horrified. Oh, how have you put such karma on me that you have bowed down to me? How will I ever recover from this? And Ramakrishna stands up and says, no, it's not like that. He says, you see, when you walked in the room, I saw the divine first, and I did what was natural. I bowed down before God. It wasn't for a few moments before I saw you as you see yourself. You see? So their inner world, this relationship with God that Brother Lawrence is calling us to, is that someone walks in the room and you are so focused on the presence of God that you naturally fall down and salute them in worship, because you recognize first and foremost their divinity, the presence of God in that person. That's a pure mind. That's a pure heart, a pure soul. That's a realized soul. For the rest of us, we see a beggar, we see an untouchable, and we react accordingly. To a knower of God, they react to the presence of God. And that's always an overwhelming sense of worship in divine love. So to worship God in truth is to acknowledge him to be what he is, to see him not as to see him not as the beggar, but to see him in the beggar. You know, that's when you come to know your own separation from body and mind, when you come to realize that you are spirit. And so once you know yourself to be spirit, that becomes part of worshiping God in spirit and in truth. You recognize that presence everywhere. It becomes something that everything reminds you of. You know, there's stories in the scriptures about an old man going into ecstasy because he saw a person with a cane made of the same type of wood that Sri Krishna's flute was made from. And that association puts his mind on Krishna. And so, boom, he goes into ecstasy in the awareness of the presence of Krishna. Or Ramakrishna went into ecstasy when he was walking through the big park in Calcutta, and he saw that English boy standing, again, leaning against his tree with one leg crossed across the other, like Krishna stands when he's playing the flute. And Ramakrishna was immediately taken to the feet of Krishna and goes into an ecstatic mood because something that mundane reminded him of the presence of God. And so he immediately went to the feet of the beloved within, into an ecstatic mood. So this is real life. And this is what Brother Lawrence is calling us to here. 3 is to worship God in truth is to admit that we separate ourselves from him. Oh, here you go. To worship God in truth is to admit that we separate ourselves from him, although he would make us like to himself if only we wished it. Oh, there he's saying the exact same thing Holy Mother says, that you can have your realization this moment if you want it. He's saying to worship God in truth is to admit that we separate ourselves, that you right now are separating yourself from God. We always like to play the victim. Oh God, please come to me. Why are you hiding yourself from me? Why can't I see you? Why have you left me? Why have you abandoned me? God does not abandon you, cannot abandon you. You would cease to exist that very split second that God separates himself from you. What happens is you separate yourself from God, not by literally separating yourself, but by deciding not to be consciously aware of that divine presence, of your own divinity. You forget, you put it out of your mind and get caught up in the world of change. And that is what separates you from God. So we have to admit that we're responsible for this. It's our own willingness to be forgetful, to enjoy our distractions, right? All of the things in this world that we go to spend time with give us nothing. They can only do one thing. They give us a distraction. And sometimes our lives are so out of balance that the only peace we can find is in distraction, going to a movie, getting drunk, getting stoned, going on vacations, gambling, reading Reddit, paging through Facebook for hours at a time. These are ways that we distract our mind from our pain, from our mundane existence when we're not aware of this amazing presence, of this incredible inner infinity that is the experience of living. So to worship God in truth is to admit we separate ourselves from him, although he would make us like to himself. He would unify with us if we only wished it. Is it not foolish to withhold from him, even for a minute, the reverence, the love, the service, and this ceaseless worship that we owe him. Owe him in the sweetest way, owe him because he has become us. And this existence that we enjoy is that Sat of Satchit Ananda, this intelligence that allows us to understand all of the things coming in through the senses, that allow us to understand the relationships between our thinking and objects. That intelligence is the divine intelligence that is God himself. And the presence that we enjoy, this isness, this being, this existence, is God. And so it's coming to an understanding of that and knowing that we live this life because the divine is within us, that we experience beauty because the divine has taught us beauty. We know love when we act accordingly or when we receive it accordingly, because God has given us that love. He has given himself to us. He is the very source of our being. So here he now has some teachings on the union of the soul with God. In Vedanta, the soul and God are one. Atman can mean individual soul, or Atman can mean that one without a second. How come they have the same word? Because they're the same thing. If you take a dish towel and you put your hand like this, kind of with all your fingers pointing up, you lay the dish towel over the top of that, and then you kind of go and put a rubber band around the top of each finger, kind of capturing the dish towel around each finger. Then you can look at the dish towel from the top, and you see 5 distinct little bumps that have been gathered together in a rubber band. Those are the 5 individuated souls of 5 individual people. But you remove them from the hand, you pull them off and kind of stretch it tight. All those rubber bands pop off, all the little nodules of separation disappear, and you realize that which was 5 is really 1. And so that is our experience of ourself. Right now, egoism has put a little rubber band around Atman and made it the individual self. And we've got billions of them running around the planet from that perspective. But in reality, it is one without a second that has been artificially boundaried to make us experience a multiplicity, to give us the allowance of building that little fence of ego to run the course of our own life, to burn out our own karma, our own ideas. By the grace of God, he allows us to take himself and to play. That's why they call this the Leela. No one's getting hurt, no one's dying, no one's being born. This is our play, right? And if we play with that knowledge, we don't suffer. If we play without that knowledge, we suffer and we enjoy. Round and round, up and down it goes. So he says there are 3 kinds of union: the habitual, the virtual, and the actual. Okay, this is interesting. Habitual union is when one is united to God simply by grace. That's a beautiful one. Because that's in a sense, that's the true one. When we accept God's grace, this is where that idea comes along. To accept infinite grace, which is what it is to be unified with God through grace alone. You've accepted infinite grace. But to accept an infinite gift, you require infinite humility. You have to surrender yourself completely. Surrender your will. Surrender your idea of who you are. Surrender your wants and your dislikes. Surrender all of it. That is what he's talking about here. This union comes through grace alone. But grace, to accept God's infinite grace, you have to come to a point of understanding that you have nothing of your own to give. It's the full realization that you are merely a manifestation of God. There is no separate you in here. That's only a wrong idea of your mind. It's egoism. And if you can accept that, if you can embrace this, that you have nothing to give, that you could never in a million years do enough practice, do enough good deeds, be perfect in every way, you have to know that you have nothing to give before you are ready to accept an infinite grace, an infinite gift. So this first one, the first union of the soul with God, is when it's simply grace alone that unites you. You have given up and surrendered every idea of individuality, every idea of separation from the divine will, from the divine presence, and laid down yourself to the divine, given yourself over completely. The second one, the virtual kind of union. Virtual union is when one begins an action whereby one is united to God and remains united with him by virtue of that action for such time as it continues. All right. How are we going to decode that one? Virtual union, it's a spiritual mood. A spiritual mood. You know, you've done a great deal of practice. You've calmed your mind quite a bit. And so for as long as that lasts, you have a sense of union with the divine. But you're not able to stay at that note. You're not able to sing that note continuously. You know, it cracks and you come back to this world, to this ideal of yourself.
Does that mean, Maharaj, during our meditation, when sometimes we feel, not togetherness, but the presence of, but not able to keep it for a while? Is that what it means?
Yeah, along that line, probably a few orders of magnitude more intense, but yes, along that idea.
It's like in samadhi.
Yeah,
people like who are having samadhi, have a samadhi or something.
Yeah, the samadhi where you go for a while, but you can't remain there. You fall back down into this delusion. All right, number 3 says actual union is the most complete, and being entirely supernatural, the most powerful. For the soul is not passive as in the other 2 states, okay? That means that the soul is not temporarily losing its sensation of separateness, which is what has happened in the previous 2, but rather she is intensely active, her movements kindling more warmth than does fire and creating more light than does the clear sun. Yet our feelings can betray us as to this union, for it is not merely an emotion, as when our heart urges us to exclaim, "My God, I love you with my whole being," or such like words. It is rather, I don't know what of the soul, beauteous, peaceful, unearthly, reverent, humble, loving, and very simple. It lifts the soul to God, impelling her to love him, to worship him, even to embrace him with caress which cannot be expressed, and which only experience can make us understand. All right, this actual union with God, this is interesting because this is a little bit different than how a Vedantist would talk about it. And the reason is, in the Christian ideal, the soul and God are always separate. They're very uncomfortable with the idea that thou art that the soul and God are one, right? So even though when you read St. John of the Cross, which is where I really noticed it, he has these experiences of union with God, and he writes about them, and a Vedantist reading it recognizes he's talking about Nirvikalpa Samadhi. This saint has experienced union with God. But you see, within the Catholic institution, you can't say that, or otherwise they're going to start a big fire and put you in it because of your blasphemy, So what they do, and you see this in the writings of St. John of the Cross, is he will express this oneness. He'll show you that this oneness. But then the last line of the paragraph, he'll say, but it wasn't actually God, and we weren't really one. My soul became like a piece of glass that was so polished and so pure that it's like holding a piece of glass in front of the sun, which means the piece of glass is completely invisible. You only see the sun, but the piece of glass is still there. So they kind of create an artificial way of talking about it so that they can maintain that eternal separation from God, but in fact, according to the really what they've actually saying and what the actual experience of sages that aren't limited by the institutions that they're a part of say that no, you actually lose yourself. You actually become one with God. As soon as you remove that ego self, it is only God that exists. All right? It's only God that exists. You were an idea, a wrong thinking in your own mind. So here he's talking of this, that when your every movement is the movement of the divine, there's a power to that. I don't know if you go to India, it's possible to meet some of these divine souls. It's you have to find them, but they're there. Ramakrishna talks about the sadhu that used to come to the temple and would chant the scriptures in the temple. And when he would chant, Ramakrishna said the building would actually vibrate, would actually shake with the intensity of this chanting. That's the chanting of someone who is completely absent of ego, that it is God clearly moving through them. That's the ability of when Ramakrishna touched Vivekananda on his chest, and Vivekananda says, I truly saw the room around me begin to whirl and the walls fall away, and I saw this infinite ocean of light, and I panicked and called out, what about my parents? And Ramakrishna said, oi, you too, calling out for your parents as you dissolve into this unity with the divine. What is this? What is this ignorance? So these are all the different ways that they talk about this notion of becoming God, of the ego disappearing. And if you can maintain or be in that state, it's not you to maintain it. In that state, it's self-maintaining. They say for a normal person, if you have this experience of unity, you can only hold on to the body for about 12 days or so, for a limited amount of time. And then the body's purpose has been served. You don't need the body anymore, and it drops off. From our perspective, you die. But from the infinite perspective, you let go of the unnecessary. You've let go of the body because you no longer feel that separation from God. You no longer have a desire to be your own master. You've surrendered that idea to the Lord. Number 4 here, he says, all who aim at union with God should know that whatever can divert the will toward him is also welcome and pleasing to it. The will makes it so. Everybody must admit that the ways of God are past our understanding, and therefore to become united to him, the will must be deprived of all of its tastes and pleasures, spiritual and material, right? Because he gives us a clue here. Look at the way he talks about this. The ways of God are past our understanding. What is he really saying there? They're past the contents of the mind. Right? The presence of God is not within the realm of understanding. Understanding happens cognitively in mind. It's past that. It's before that. All right. And the will must be deprived of all of its tastes, pleasures, spiritual and material. That's a complete letting go of anything that the ego finds lacking in the moment. It means to see the moment as perfected, that there's nothing missing. And it's to resign that whole habit of always trying to make the moment perfect by having another drink, by getting a piece of pizza, by having a hot bath, whatever it is you think that is going to make this moment more perfect. Those are the things you lay down because you realize the moment is perfect. You're sitting in a place beyond mind. So that means beyond the limit of your senses, beyond the limit of your body, beyond the limit of your mind. And so to sit in that space, you have to surrender all of these things, these individual things, these things based on the world of change. You have to surrender to that absolute isness within. Then being thus stripped, it is free to love God above all things. For if the will is able in any degree to know God, it can only be through love. There is a great difference between the tastes and fancies of the will and the workings of the same will, for its preferences and conceits are within the soul as in their bounds, but its operation, which is love, has its end in God. Right? So this is when you turn into a hole through which God can be seen. You no longer have there's no longer a named person here anymore. You are purely an expression of the divine will, which is perfect love, perfect wisdom, and the fullness of being. And that is the divine. We'll save these for next week. Of the presence of God, he's got 7 more things there, and then means for attaining to the presence of God, then benefits of the presence of God, as if we would need such a thing, and then we'll be finished. So it looks like another 3 classes on these things, and we'll be finished. Are there questions in there? Complaints? Concerns?
Swami,
Yes.
how about for some of us, me particularly, the faith doesn't come naturally, so it's a struggle for me to think about a Ishta Devata, a God with form, even though intellectually I know there's no other way to come to that final moment, but through grace. So you need that faith. But it's like that. You feel you need it. It's not coming naturally, so you're faking it.
Right.
What happens there?
Well, everything begins in imagination, right? The room you're sitting in right now once existed only in the architect's imagination. And he had faith that he could build it, that this could happen. And so he made those arrangements. He went and got materials. He took out a large amount of money, paid a whole bunch of builders and architects to create and manage the building. So what does that mean to us as a spiritual seeker? I think the way to faith is discernment. It's becoming acutely aware of the reality that you're living in. So it's watching the mind very closely. The first things that I like is that there are several things that we know or that we have ideas of that the world of senses, the world that we live in, could not have produced. If we really were material beings, we could not have an ideal of any kind, because there is no ideal in existence in this world. We don't see a perfect anything. And yet we're intimately familiar with the idea of perfection. We're always striving for this ideal. All of evolution is striving toward an ideal. So you begin meditating on that. Whose ideal? What evolution implies a perfection? That things are evolving, that they're becoming better and better and better, moving toward a perfection. Where and what is that perfection? So you begin to notice things like that. We have things in us that we shouldn't know, like immortality. Even as an idea, nothing in this world can give you the idea of immortality, because there is nothing that is immortal. How is it that we understand that? How is it that we have that notion of something that we've never experienced, that there is nothing in this material world to teach us of that? Of infinity. Everything is bounded in this material world. And yet we're very comfortable with the idea of infinity. So you begin noticing these things that you can't know from the material world. And you have to ask yourself, if the material world is the end of the matter, where are these ideas coming from? Where did we learn these things? You know, and then you become acutely aware of the fact that you read things like they say that you make a decision about, what was it? Something like 3 seconds before your conscious mind is aware of that decision. Well, who made that decision? Where did that decision come from? You know, so you begin to see things like that when Ramakrishna says, you're not the doer. Well, your first thought is, that is absurd. Look at this, Ramakrishna. I picked up my mouse. Look, tell me I'm not the doer, you know? But then begin thinking about it. Tell me exactly when I move my finger like this. How is that happening? Do I know how that's happening? Do I have any idea of how that happens? How is thought being converted into action? Where does that happen? And how does it happen? How am I able to use a body that I don't know anything about? I have no idea how those muscles work, how those nerves work, how they interact, what chemical reactions are required. And yet, there it is, I'm watching it happen. How is it that I eat a carrot and my body is able to dismantle that carrot down to its molecular level, take those pieces, and then rebuild them into tissue, bone, muscle, blood, all of these number of things, none of which I have any idea how to do. And yet my body is doing it as casually and as often as I breathe, all day long. How is that possible? How is it that mankind has been on this planet for tens of thousands of years at least, and we still cannot produce a portable solar power plant like a leaf? You know, how is that a leaf on a tree, one of billions, they've been there for 1,000,000 years, and they have known how to take the energy of the sun in a leaf and produce, you know, convert that into usable sugars and nutrients for the tree to grow from. You just begin to look at the impossibilities of what we accept as normal. You begin to become aware of the impossibilities of what we see, of what's going on around us all the time. That's where faith comes from. And then when a sage who has no motive, he doesn't care one way or the other whether you believe him or not, tells you, I have touched something that is beyond description. I can't even tell you, but look in my eyes. Let me touch your chest and give you a sense of it, you know. That's where faith is born. Faith is born from awareness. You know, lack of faith comes from dullness. It's when you accept the impossible as ordinary. You've stopped seeing. You've stopped understanding the impossible situation that we're in. How can it be? You know? So that's where faith is. There's a wonderful, I'll have to dig it up. I'll send you a quote from one of Vivekananda's disciples, where he talks about faith is not believing something without any evidence, but faith is an intuitive knowing, an intuitive relationship that you have with reality. I'll have to dig it up because it's a beautiful definition of faith. You can see that faith is becoming aware of the impossibility of your existence. You know, becoming aware of the impossibility of your existence. It's thinking deeply. Like the first time that it occurred to me that I had never seen the outside world, right? I'll tell you this, everybody else has probably heard this a dozen times from me, but it's one of my favorite things to think about. I have never, I like to look at a light, you know, look at the light in your room and realize you're not seeing the light in your room. That light never gets to your brain. There's no, when it hits the eye, there's bone behind the eye. That light is not going in there. That we assume that the eye is converting that light to a signal, to a biochemical encoding. And that encoding makes its way through the nerves, and the brain gets that encoding and then creates a symbol for what it represents. It creates a symbol for light. And that light bulb that you're staring at You have no idea what that actually looks like. What you're looking at is the symbol that your mind has created in response to the neurochemical signals that it gets from the nerves. And it's that way for everything. So you literally do not know that there's an outside world. You do not know the source of your senses, because your ear that you assume is where sound comes from is just as much a symbol for the source of sound as the sound itself is a symbol for what the ear is hearing. And when you come to think at that level, when you've stared at your mind long enough and analyzed what's going on, faith is born, because you see the impossibility of your existence. And you begin to wonder, what in the world is happening here? How can all of this be real? You know, how can a tree know how to produce solar energy when we, in all of our efforts over thousands of years, have yet to do anything but this giant, clunky, massive solar panel that needs a 400-pound battery and 25 yards of wiring hooked up to it to function? And even then, it just gives a minuscule amount of power, whereas a tree, has learned to do it in beauty, in elegance, miniaturized, down at a microscopic scale. How? How did that happen? How can that possibly be? You're, I don't know, those things like that. Anyway, that's one idea around it. Begin observing the world very closely. Begin asking questions that you stopped asking when you were 5. Or take a walk with a toddler. Take a walk with a toddler and try and answer all of his or her questions. You always find you can only answer about 3 questions. And then you're like, I don't know. That's because God put it there. I don't know. So that would be one approach. Become aware, and faith becomes necessary.
Okay.
Surely. All right, my friends.
Thank you,
Be
Maharaj.
well. Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Swami. Wonderful class. Wonderful.
Excellent. That's heartening. All right, be well.
Be well, everybody.
Faithful. Realize God.
Thank you, Swami. Good night.
Good night, Rangu. Jai Ma.